The C.S. Lewis Institute presents an interview with Dr. Art Lindsley, based on his book, C.S. Lewis's Case for Christ, with Leesa Donner.
Wish Fulfillment and Postmodernism, Chapters 9 and 10. Two fascinating topics for today's discussion. So let's dig right in. Art, start us off with a story. How did C.S. Lewis communicate these ideas in his writings?
Well, I said in a previous session that he combined reason and imagination, that reason is a natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. And I think I referred to the idea that in Narnia, he communicated all the basic truths that are here, that were there in his philosophy and in his theology. And he did this even with the idea of wish fulfillment and Freud. There's a little story in The Silver Chair where towards the end of the story, the Green Witch puts all of the kids in. C.S. Lewis' actually favorite character that he made up was Puddleglum, the marshwiggle, the pessimist that was always there. But Puddleglum was under the enchantment for a while, but he heard the Green Witch say that there are no sun, moon, and stars, and no Narnia, and no Aslan. And he stuck his foot, his marshwiggle foot, into the fire, and it woke him up, and the smell of burnt marshwiggle filled the air. And his mind was clear just enough to say, well, perhaps there is no Aslan and no Narnia and no sun, moon, and stars. But the world that we've made up in our make-believe is far better than your dark underworld that you have here. Kind of a backhanded slap at the Freudian idea that all of our ideas of religion are made up or wish fulfillment.
It's long been said that Christianity is nothing more than a crutch, kind of a silly notion that helps us get through life with simplified answers to complex questions. How did Lewis really answer that argument?
Well, I think we're going to be going through some of the more detailed arguments, but I would say one way he might have dealt with it, he didn't use the term crutch as much, but you could just say, on the other hand, that atheism is a crutch. It really helps people be able to be free from the moral constraints that a belief in God might have. I remember one time I was with my wife Connie on our honeymoon in Bora Bora. We stayed in the Hotel Oa Oa in Bora Bora. And the head of the establishment, the owner, came out and he found that we were doing religious type of work, and he said, I think Christianity's a crutch. And I said, well, you know, I think you could equally say that atheism is a crutch. And I explained it in the way that I did, summarizing some of the things I did in the chapter. And it took him back, you know. And because I was able to disarm that critique in that way, we went on to have a very positive conversation.
There are three influential atheists that you mention in your book that really have had a profound effect on our culture and our world. Can you outline who they are and just a little bit about each of their beliefs? I'll
give you the soundbite version. Ludwig Feuerbach was one who wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity that argued that religion is a projection, or another way to put it in a summary way, that theology is anthropology, that God, people in religious beliefs just take their own humanity and project it out onto the universe in an infinite degree. So we feel inadequate and fearful, and we make up a God who is omnipotent and all-powerful. We're limited in knowledge, and so we make up a God that's all-knowing, and so on and so on. It's essentially, we project our own humanity onto the universe to make us feel better about the fragile world in which we live.
So it's an imaginary process.
Yeah. It's a projection of our own human inadequacies or weaknesses onto the universe. It makes us feel better about it. That was Feuerbach. But then Freud and Marx are two that actually took Feuerbach, and they'd read Feuerbach's work. And Marx took it in another direction where he focused more on the economic dimension of who people are. And he said that religion is the opiate of the people. That religion is used to dull the senses of workers who are being oppressed, and they're told just be content with the oppression and inadequate wages, that kind of thing, and you will get your pie in the sky by and by. So it's used as an opiate to dull people's senses and make them content despite the oppression that they're in. And so he wanted to smash the opiate, religion, in order to let the workers revolt. Or Freud saw religion as being wish fulfillment, something you make up, perhaps a giant Oedipal complex or something like that.
Let's go back a little bit to Marx. In your book, you make the point that Marx is really the ultimate materialist. And in his argument, he talks about all of us sort of really, the opiate of the masses is where we're nothing more than sheep. And that's often been leveled at Christians, don't think. I had a friend who said, the problem with you Christians is that you're really great at brainwashing yourselves. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're constantly telling yourself, you're memorizing scripture, so you're constantly telling yourself a bunch of lies in her case. How do we answer that kind of nothing but sheep argument?
Well, the way I usually do it when I talk to people is I admit some truth in each of the critiques. That religion can be a projection. Say, for instance, people can project the image of their own father on God. If, say, a very harsh father, they think of God in that way, or a very marshmallowy father, they project God in that way. So there's a partial truth to it, or there's a partial truth to the opiate idea that sometimes Christians in history, and Marxists can find the illustrations very well, that show that religion has been used as a tool to keep people in bad positions. Or also, you have the idea religion sometimes can be wish fulfillment. Some people say, my God is a God of blank. It's whatever God, the kind of God that they want to have, rather than the God I believe that is.
The gospel according to Art or Leesa.
It's usually the idea that my God is a God of love, and they take it from there. But I would say that a partial truth, taken as a whole truth, becomes an untruth. And I think even though there are partial truths that are there are basic fallacies in this wish fulfillment argument.
Stop. Say that again. A partial truth,
taken as the whole truth, becomes an untruth. And there are fundamental fallacies in this wish fulfillment argument.
What are a few of them?
Well, the most basic fallacy is, even though that this argument has been perhaps the most influential argument in forwarding atheism, along with the problem of evil and evolution, there's a fundamental fallacy in that they provide a psychological explanation for the belief in God, which might be plausible if you knew there was no God. But that's begging the question. That's the fundamental fallacy, is a fallacy of begging the question. That, for instance, Lewis uses the illustration. If you think that I am making up the idea that I have a very large balance in my bank account, and you want to project onto it a psychological explanation, it might be good to check out the fact first, to see whether I have a large balance and have such a bank account, before you start proceeding to a psychological explanation as to why I might have invented it. That atheists skip the most important question, whether God exists, and jump to the psychological explanation.
Talk to us a little bit about bulverism. I love that in the book, and it's really hard to retain.
I would say that one of the most classic essays of C.S. Lewis is this essay on bulverism. And he takes on this wish fulfillment idea, but he makes up an imaginary character, Ezekiel Bulver, who at age 5 hears his mother arguing with his father, and his father is arguing that two sides of a triangle taken together are greater than that of the third. And the mother says, "Oh, you say that because you're a man." And Ezekiel Bulver said, "It came across my opening mind that refutation is no necessary part of an argument." And so I would say that bulverism is essentially the idea that it's easier and better and safer, actually, to reject somebody's perspective and attribute it to a psychological origin rather than to try to refute the argument. Because if you try to refute the argument, you actually might lose it. It might lose the argument. Much safer to use a psychological ploy. And he said every political argument involves bulverism, that you tend to reject the other person's position and call names rather than deal with the substance of what they say.
Gee, I feel like I've been in a lot of those arguments now that you've outlined it for me. Let's talk a little bit about postmodernism. First of all, it's a term that's thrown around an awful lot. What is it?
Well, a lot of people think that even postmodernism can't even be defined, so I'm going to
go out on a limb.
Take on the impossible and say at least what some people have said that it is. There's a postmodern philosopher, Lyotard, who said that you can put postmodernism in 3 words: an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Now, a meta-narrative, a narrative is a story. A meta-narrative is a grand story, an all-encompassing story. Like, for instance, Christianity is a grand meta-narrative. It starts with God who exists from all eternity, and then the creation, the fall, and the history of redemption, and then the consummation in a new heavens and new earth, and then on for all eternity. So it's an all-encompassing story. Same for Judaism or Islam, or maybe even Marxism is a grand meta-narrative. And they particularly are incredulous or suspicious towards grand stories or meta-narratives because they believe that they're oppressive. And I suppose they mean that they're always oppressive, or most of the time oppressive. I think they take the idea that they're always oppressive. And they do make the assumption, which is correct, I suppose, that all oppression is bad. But they also say there is no objective truth, which it's interesting that their main definition involves the assumption that oppression is bad.
Okay, so Christianity is a meta-narrative, and the meta-narrative intrinsically has oppression in it.
Yes. And that would be underlying assumption, that there are no objective truths. And they deal legitimately with the idea that it's difficult to be objective. We do bring a lot of our subjectivity into understanding things. But that doesn't mean that there aren't real objective facts.
Could you say postmodernism is really everything is relative?
Postmodernism is a form of relativism. It does have the idea that there are no absolute or objective values such as good and evil, but they even take it further, take it to a higher level, that you can't know anything objectively, even science. And that's very problematic. Most scientists, even though there are occasional scientists that hold a more postmodern perspective, most scientists reject postmodernism.
I was going to ask you if there are scientists from, the modern world who really have embraced Christianity and rejected this idea of postmodernism and everything is relative.
Yeah, I have a friend who's the head of a biology department, and he said that most scientists have rejected it. For instance, he used the illustration that pretty much everybody would say it's an objective fact that smoking causes cancer. Or Don Carson says that we're able to deal with objectivity enough that we can put someone on the moon, and so on and so on. There seemed to be enough objectivity in the world to do a whole lot of things in technology and in business, that sort of thing.
What would C.S. Lewis have responded to Nietzsche's claim that there are no facts, only interpretations? And aren't you really making an interpretation by answering that question? So how does this all sort of relate in the larger picture to postmodernism?
Well, I think the idea is that they want to say that everything's a perspective.
But that's just your perspective.
Well, yeah, and there's some truth to perspectivalism, that we do bring our perspectives to bear in studying history and in interpreting various matters. But again, the idea that there's no objective fact or no objective truth does seem to be self-refuting, because you say that there's no objective facts. Is that an objective statement? Or everything's a matter of interpretation. Is that a matter of interpretation? So it does tend to be self-refuting, as you were alluding to.
So wrapping up this whole discussion on wish fulfillment and postmodernism, what would you say, let's just address the believer for a minute. These are obviously stumbling blocks to faith for the unbeliever, but for the believer, how do we move forward? How do we address these as they come at us in our everyday world?
I think we'll address some of that as we look at relativism, but the idea is to admit some truth in the postmodern claim, the difficulty of objectivity and the difficulty of just imposing our culture's perspective on other cultures while still upholding the idea that there is truth. We have to hold it, though, in a way that is winsome and attractive and not harsh and judgmental in that kind of way.
Thank you. This has been very thought-provoking.
Thank you.